Hello everyone, I hope you're all keeping well, healthy and happy. So a few of you have been asking me to compile a reading list for yourselves. One which has been enormously useful for myself and which I think you would find enormously useful as well, because we're living in a time of great confusion and ignorance. And what is happening is that civilization itself is collapsing in decay as a result of this mass ignorance, as a result of people having chosen to be willfully ignorant. And the only way to dispel that ignorance is through the acquisition of knowledge. One of the things that I find particularly distressing is that people are shunning knowledge at the moment. There is this strain of anti-intellectualism in true terms, which has branched off partly from postmodernist philosophy and partly from the communist Marxist underlying ideology, which has hijacked the institutions, right? Every educational institution today has become an ideological indoctrination center. They're driven by ideology rather than a wish and a will to truly educate people. And that is a very, very sad thing indeed. And more people are beginning to notice this. But they don't understand the core reasons why this is happening. As I say, part of it comes from postmodern thought. And part of it comes from the various societies, if you will, that were set up. That were working towards a greater agenda. Now, I've spoken about the Frankfurt School, members of which included Antonio Gramsci, Herbert Marcuse, and of course Adorno, right? And these people have completely and utterly invaded the institutions, and they started setting the agenda in the institutions through the long march through the institutions, right? And they also created these various occult societies, like the Fabian Society and the Club of Rome. Now, whether you believe in the occult or not is irrelevant. The fact of the matter is that these people adhered to an agenda, and it is a fact, by the way, and I'm going to show you some of the books on this as well, which are part of my recommended reading list. But it was driven by an ideological agenda from the get-go, and it stemmed from the thoughts of a madman, essentially, some 150 years ago, called Francois Fourier. Now, I've spoken about him in the video that I made about this occultocracy that we're currently living in which democracy is no longer relevant. You're actually living under an occultocracy, which a lot of people don't understand at all. But you have to look into the works of these people and what they were saying and the basic tenets of their, let's loosely call it a philosophy. It's actually far more insidious than that. It's a doctrine that was espoused, and it's a doctrine which involves creating this utopian society in which the undesirables are eliminated from that society. Okay, now how many times have we seen that happen? How many times have we heard it all before? People still don't understand that this is in play at the moment, right? There's new faces, there's new puppets in the arena, but really the puppet masters are all just the same. Okay, but let's get into the reading list that I was talking about, which hopefully will help some people to get to grips with what is currently going on, this present day paradigm. So the first book I'm going to recommend is called Postmodernism by Stephen Hicks. Now, this version's an audio copy which I got, but you can buy this in hard copy format as well. You will have to track it down. I don't believe it's in print any longer, but you should be able to find it nonetheless. There's copies available online. If you want a PDF format copy, if you message me on that, I will send you it. This is the work that basically explains postmodernist thought and where it comes from. And Stephen Hicks does a brilliant job on this. He's a PhD. He has a PhD in the matter, so he understands exactly what he's talking about. The other book I would recommend to people out there as well is this book here called Maps of Meaning by Jordan B. Peterson. Right now, this is a copy that Professor Peterson sent me some months ago. It's a signed copy from him. So thank you very much for that, Dr. Peterson. It has been immensely informative in terms of the mythological arcs that exist in human civilization and the role they've played in our evolution, as well as understanding the neuropsychological aspects in the way that we interact with the world at large. So enormously useful on that front. The third book I'd recommend is Carl Jung's Psychology and Alchemy. Okay, this is a book that will, I wouldn't recommend it to everyone, but only to those people who are familiar with Carl Jung's work already. And he explains the archetypes that are involved in human thinking, if you will, oftentimes unconscious or subconscious thinking, and the collective unconscious as well in the role that it plays. There are distinct biological factors involved in many of the thought forms that manifest themselves in human beings. And Jung looked at this very deeply, and he found that there were cases in which those forms of thought, which were fundamentally nihilistic in his time, in Germany, in 1930s, 1940s Germany, became murderous. So he was looking at the collective and why the collective became possessed ideologically and why it became driven to commit acts of evil and murder, right? So again, enormously useful work. Also by Carl Jung is Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. This is absolutely a must-read for anyone who wishes to understand again the role that our psychology plays in the world at large and our mythologies play in the world at large as well. I would also recommend The Sword and the Shield. Okay, now this is a book that basically details the relevant parts from the Metrokin archive that I spoke about in the very first video that I put up. Okay, it's written by Christopher Andrew and Vasily Metrokin himself. It was compiled by them, and it's an absolutely indispensable work on Soviet espionage, the role that the Soviet state played in the infiltration of Western countries, various countries in the West, and how even today we are still seeing the effects of all of that, the subversion that took place, the psychological warfare that was waged on the West. Another book I would strongly recommend is New Lies for Old by Anatoly Golitsyn. Okay? These two books, by the way, the Metrokin Archive book and New Lies for Old, were written by ex-KGB officers who understood what they were talking about. They had defected to the West because they could no longer morally put up with what was going on. And Golitsyn details the communist strategy of deception and the methods of disinformation which were used to gain control and gain a foothold in various countries that stood in direct opposition to communist thought. Okay? This book also you will need to have in your archive. Okay? This is Disinformation. The book is called Disinformation. It was written by Ion Mihai Pachepa, who I spoke about in the video I did on communism, the resurgence of communism, and the New World Order. Okay? Believe me, the New World Order is very, very real. It's a very real phenomenon. And if you look into it deep enough, you will see where it branched off from. You will see exactly what it is. It is communist doctrine. That's what it fundamentally is. Okay? And it does go back to the works of Francois Fourier during the French Revolution, who I spoke about. Okay? These occult societies, like the Fabian Society, like the Club of Rome, have been absolutely responsible for the decimation and destruction of Western civilization as we're seeing it today. Okay? But Disinformation, this is written by Pachepa. He was a former spy chief in communist in the communist bloc. And it details the secret strategies which were used not only by the KGB and GRU, but the various groups that were around then to infiltrate the West, to actually implement the precise plans that were drawn up by the Frankfurt School, okay, by Gramsci, by all these various people, and fundamentally at the core of it by Fourier and Babeuf, who later gave rise to Marx and his work, and Engels, and then eventually Hitler himself. Okay, so the Nazi Party's ideologies, the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, their ideologies, all stemmed off from this branch of nihilistic thought form, right? Which was that the undesirables must be eliminated. And if you read these works, you'll begin to understand what is going on in the modern day, in modern times. Okay? Another book I'm going to recommend to you is National Security Cinema. This was written by Matthew Alford and Tom Secker, and it details how the military-industrial complex has a vast say and a great deal of sway in Hollywood in terms of the movies that are made. Many of the narratives that are constructed by Hollywood are done and they're created so that their own insidious form of thought can be perpetuated. And much of that relies on the same ideas as the Soviet Union, by the way. Okay? To understand this, you first have to understand, as I've talked about many times, that the State Department itself in the United States was completely infiltrated by communist spies. Okay, now I'm not suggesting people go out there and start seeing communists everywhere, right? What I'm trying to explain to you is that the fundamental branches of government were taken over a long time ago, and they began implementing their own agendas through those. And I've spoken about this many, many times through many of my videos, right? But that's another book I would recommend in terms of the great role that the military-industrial complex, if you like to call it the deep state, you can, the role that the deep state plays in creating their own type of propaganda, which in turn serves the same agenda as the powers that existed in the former Soviet Union. Okay? Apart from all of that, I would also recommend people buy this book. Okay? This is Persuasion. The book's called Persuasion, and it's written by Robert Cialdini. Okay? Why do you need to read this book? Well, because it explains the fundamentals of how people can be psychologically manipulated, whether it's by corporations, whether it's by governments, whether it's by just about anyone else with an agenda, pretty much. Okay? It does outline how one would go about manipulating people as well, so there is an ethical consideration in terms of recommending this book. But it's still nonetheless very useful to those people that wish to ward off the influence or the undue influence and persuasion tactics which are used by the powers that should not be. So I'm still going to recommend that book, that people read that. Another book I would recommend that people read, although I don't have it with me in this room, I've just noticed, I think it's still in the library. Another book I'd recommend is Dennis L. Cuddy's Road to Socialism, The Road to Socialism and the New World Order. Let me repeat that. It is Dennis L. Cuddy. That's spelled C-U-D-D-Y. He wrote this book in order to explain in depth how the American education system became this tool of indoctrination and how it became driven by its ideological underpinnings fundamentally. And he also talks about the failings of the education system. He talks about John Dewey. John Dewey was, in fact, a Fabian socialist himself. And some of these people were responsible for creating the American education system. They're responsible for making it into what it is today. So very important to read that. I would also recommend, on the same subject, John Gatto's work. Okay, Gatto. John Gatto was also enormously well placed and well versed to understand what was going on in the education system. And he wrote a number of books on this same matter, on this same subject. But it's enormously useful to understand what is going on in the current day education system and why it has turned into this behemoth. Why it programs people fundamentally into becoming drones, right? Again, I could say much more about that, and I probably will in future videos, but those are just, again, some of the books I would recommend. One other book on the education system that I would strongly recommend, or one other author rather, is Charlotte Iserbet Thompson. Okay, she's written in line with, in parallel with Dennis Cuddy and John Gatto, many books, many articles on this same subject of how the education system was subverted. Okay, how it became this thing which it is. And again, I would recommend her work to people as well. So these three people who were very much involved in the education system, they were either teachers or they were on boards, education boards and so on. They all understood what was happening and they tried to warn the public. But not enough people read their work. Okay? On the subject of Soviet subversion, before I forget, another book I would recommend, and I've been recommending this to people on other social media platforms, is Putin's Kleptocracy. Okay? Putin, as in President Putin, right? Putin's Kleptocracy by Karen Dawishaw. Okay, that's Dawisha. You must read this book in order to understand, because it ties in with Golitsyn's work, because it explains to people the fact that the Soviet Union, when it went into its period of downfall, how it never truly converted to capitalism, right? How it maintained the structures and foundations of communist belief within the government structures, and how the oligarchies which operate in the Russian Federation today are hoping to re-establish another Soviet Union, a far greater Soviet Union, if you will. Okay? So that's another book I'd recommend by Karen Dawishaw. It's called Putin's Kleptocracy. Other books I would recommend include Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. Obviously, Professor Peterson and others have recommended this to many people as well, so I would do the same thing. Please do read that. The Gulag Archipelago details the plight and the suffering of the Soviet people in concentration camps, which were set up by the communists, right? So that's necessary to read in order to understand what the end result fundamentally of communism is, of socialism is, of this postmodernist neo-Marxist thought form is. Okay, it ends in mass killings. It has always ended in mass killings, and there's no getting around that, right? Although in the modern time, because of ignorance, because history has been jumbled up and is being the school systems are teaching things that are plain wrong. What is happening is that people are being indoctrinated into believing communism is wonderful, socialism is wonderful. I'm not really sure why they believe these things, but they do. But it's very easy to convince people of that if you eradicate history completely and utterly. So I would recommend people do read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. On a subject slightly related to this, as another recommendation, which looks into the psychology of people, which ties into the works by Carl Jung and Professor Peterson's work as well to a great extent, is Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Okay, you have to read this book, if only to understand how human psychology factors into all of this, right? So those are my primary recommendations as a basic reading list. I would also recommend Baruch Spinoza's work, okay, particularly his work on ethics, because these were some of the foremost thinkers that were around. He was a materialist, but he does a great job of distilling the importance of ethics and where ethical frameworks come from and why they're necessary. He was very, very pro-natural law. Okay, so Spinoza's work, that's Spinoza, right? Do look up his work. I would also recommend all the Greek philosophers as well. I mean, there's so many works I could recommend here, to be honest with you, so it's going to be quite a list. But Aristotle's work on the Trivium is enormously useful. I would also strongly recommend Aristotle's book on rhetoric, which, similar to Cialdini, talks about persuasion and how to best persuade people via rhetoric, but also details what has to come before rhetoric. So the Trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, Aristotle wrote about them quite extensively. So please do read those works. Don't miss those out. Some of you have also been asking me to recommend various occult works as well. And I will do this in this video also, so that you have a better understanding of what the agenda actually is and where it comes from. Okay? And I wouldn't recommend these books lightly unless you've actually studied the occult in depth, right? And there's a reason why I wouldn't fully recommend these, because it's all too easy to descend into this mode of thinking via these works that you've attained ultimate wisdom, okay? Because they're presented in these ways. Many of these New Age works that have been written in modern times are designed to do exactly that, to make you believe you are fundamentally a god, right? Not that there's anything wrong with that theologically per se. The problem is, in those kind of belief systems, in what later became postmodernist thought actually, right, that you are the only thing that you can verify, i.e. solipsism, right? The problem with that mode of thinking is that it leads to absolute contempt for all humanity and a fundamental intellectual arrogance in people, which ends up becoming self-destructive. Okay, so that's the warning I will give before I recommend these works, right? But they are important to read nonetheless. So the first work I would suggest people read is The History of Magic, right, by Eliphas Levi. Now, when you say magic, people immediately think of spells and voodoo and crazy things like this. But actually what Levi was detailing in this book and other books as well was how to manipulate groups of people and how to manipulate thought and the ways in which philosophy might serve the purpose of doing so. Okay? And he also details the Kabbalistic belief systems, both the positive and the negative, and the ideology that basically gave rise to, birthed this insidious form of nihilistic thought. Okay, this self-destructive bent, this bent for destruction that particularly solipsists are given to. Because what happens is, people who are solipsistic not only have contempt for all other people, they actually end up with a contempt for themselves. They decry their own existence because they've ceased to have a purpose. See, their false belief that they have gained ultimate wisdom leads to them no longer having anything further to pursue. And that's an incredibly dangerous place to be, which is why they become murderous ultimately as well. But Eliphas Levi's work is very important. It plays a great role in understanding what happened and why it's happening and how all this New Age garbage that's being pumped out there came to be. Okay? As I say, it comes from the negative aspects of Kabbalistic thought. On a related note, this is a copy of MacGregor Mather's The Kabbalah Unveiled. Okay? And I strongly recommend this to anyone who wants to understand Kabbalistic belief. Okay, the philosophies of the Kabbalah. Because they're used in Freemasonry. They're used in occult societies even today. They're used in satanic belief systems as well. They're also used in positive ways in Hermetic philosophy. It's not that they're evil or anything along those lines, so please snap out of that form of thinking, right? Because it's not necessarily dualistic as you might believe. It's not black and white. There are aspects to the Kabbalah which are enormously useful, and there are aspects in the Kabbalah, what is known as the Qlipothic realm, which are enormously destructive. Now, I've explained this in my detailed video on the occult, which I uploaded some time ago. But to gain more insight into this, I would recommend these works. This is also useful. Okay. This is the Transcendental Magic, its Doctrine and Ritual, that was written by Eliphas Levi. And that explains the fundamentals of these various secret societies and their beliefs and why they believe the things they do and what it is that they actually believe. Okay? I can't go into all of this here. This is the great problem because it's far more intricate, far more complex, far more in-depth than I have time for here. It would take years to go through all the fundamentally brilliant material in these books. Okay? But they are going to be enormously useful to you in understanding many of the things we're speaking about. This is Magic in Theory and Practice, written by Aleister Crowley. This is basically a beginner's guide to understanding the occult. Okay? How things were shrouded in various symbolic terms, like astrotheology, okay, and the roles and the connections and the memetics, if you will, right? People talk about meme magic today, right? People talk about memes, memetics, but it started a long time ago, and these were some of the first people that came along and really explained what memetics were and how it works. Right? How you can manipulate psychology. Okay? How you can manipulate the psychology of people to make them obedient to your will. Okay? But they also had here's another enormously interesting thing about all of this. They also had a phenomenal understanding of natural law. Right? So they also knew that there were immutable, universal moral laws which exist in the universe itself, in this world that we occupy. And the fact that they must not be transgressed lightly by people, right? There are actions and there are consequences to those actions. They understood this very, very well, in case you think they didn't, okay? And people today need to understand these things also, because if they don't, they'll just continue down this path of self-destruction. They'll continue until there's nothing left. And this is, again, this has been done to people on purpose, okay? The eradication of the moral core, the eradication of morality and truth. And I'm not talking about morality in a religious sense, Okay? I'm talking about morality in the sense of, if you do something profoundly evil, you will find that it has consequences which are, in turn, quite severe. Right? This notion of karma, okay, it's not entirely inaccurate. The way that the West has adopted this has become an inaccurate kind of way of putting things forward, right? But in real terms, there is a very real aspect to that. If you do great evil, then you'll find that there is a price for it in this life. There is suffering that accompanies that. And it only multiplies exponentially the more that you do that causes harm. Okay? The more harm you cause in your life to others, the more harm will be visited upon you. This is what a whole lot of people don't get, right? Because what they've been taught by the people that run the school system, what they've been taught by Fabian socialists, what they've been taught by the Club of Rome and the banking cartels and everyone else that basically runs this entire make-believe world, is that there are no consequences to your actions, so do what you like. Okay? This is what people have been taught wrongly. That you can do whatever you like and there will be no consequences. I.e., you have rights, but you don't have any responsibilities. That's a very, very dangerous thing to teach people. Okay, it's a very dangerous thing to teach people, because if you just do what you like, but you don't understand that you have responsibilities, you'll frequently find that you do things on impulse or out of instinct without considering the consequences of your actions. That's how evil happens. Okay, it's pure impulse. Most people here's the thing, most people don't understand that instinct and impulse, whilst they can be useful for informing your decision-making processes, are utterly useless for making solid life choices. Okay? Because your id, if you will, as Freud put it, okay, your id doesn't understand anything about having a conscience. It doesn't understand anything about what will happen if it carries out its will impulsively, right? Your instincts don't understand any of this stuff, right? Because your instinct comes from your base biological self, your base reptilian brain, if you will, right? The fundamental parts that make you an animal, your animalistic self, has no conception of right and wrong, of moral good and evil. And this is what's been propagated out there. Okay, I'm going into a bit of a rant here, apologise for that, but it's quite important that people understand that. Now, the final book I'll recommend here in terms of occult works, there's a whole myriad I could recommend, and I've got a whole library of them, but this is the final work I'm going to recommend, which is occult in nature. This is the Opus Mago Kabbalisticum et Theosophicum, right? It's written by Georg von Velling, okay? Von Velling understood a considerable amount about the occult. He understood a considerable amount about the mystical philosophies that existed in ancient times. He knew properly, I would say, what good and evil was. Okay? And this basic idea, although it was bastardized and distilled over time into the religiousized concept of good and evil, which was actually not entirely correct. But that that understanding of good and evil is what prevents people from going out there and massacring others. Okay? That's what prevents you. Because believe it or not, you have the capacity to do great evil. Okay, everyone has the capacity to do great evil. And this is part of the reason why, by the way, when the Nuremberg trials happened, okay, and you can see this also in a number of psychological experiments which were carried out over the decades, like Milgram's experiment, for example, and others, okay, in which people are all too ready to obey those in authority. Okay, they're all too ready to obey those in authority, in positions of power. Okay, and that can be misused. They can be manipulated very easily into abusing other people. Again, it's that concept of rights without responsibility. Okay, and this is why people end up becoming brutal and evil. That is what evil is. It's to inflict suffering on others without understanding that you are transgressing a boundary in doing that. Okay, it's part of the reason why, I hate to turn this into a bit of a lecture, right, but it's part of the reason why so often through human history people have frequently become evil, or they've done evil things. And if you ask them, you wouldn't think, they don't think that anything they did was evil. Okay, during the Nuremberg trials, the people that were responsible for supporting the totalitarian regime which existed said that they were just following orders. The same thing happened in the communist Soviet Union. Okay, every time totalitarianism or tyranny comes about, people use this excuse that they were merely following orders. And they don't just use it, they believe it. They absolve themselves of their own responsibility because they're told by the totalitarians, you have lots of rights, but you have no responsibilities. Okay? That is what causes most of the things that you're seeing in this world today. That's what keeps perpetuating the cycle of violence, the cycles of evil, the cycles of war, of hatred, of suffering. That's where it's coming from. And until human beings learn that you're not merely just born with inalienable rights without any responsibility, until human beings learn that, they won't better themselves. But if governments are teaching you that you don't have responsibilities to your fellow human beings, my goodness me, it's not going to be a good situation, is it? And why is it that people obey orders so readily? Well, part of it we've talked about, but another part to this is that they don't understand that many of the people who are perceived to have power, to have authority, are lying to them. They're lying to them. Okay, this was something I was thinking about before, just these last couple of days actually. This occurred to me. Where does authority come from? Authority comes from, typically, the perception that someone is an expert in a given field. Okay, someone knows what they're talking about. For example, you expect an electrician to know about electricity, right? Electronics, okay? If you're talking to a chemist, you expect they know about chemistry. If you talk to someone who's a medical professional, you expect them to know about medicine, right? And in most of these cases, people do know their onions. They are experts in their field, which is why you can trust them many a time. But, as Cialdini explains, and as Aristotle oftentimes explains in his works as well, along come people who can masquerade as true authorities, as true experts. They're the ones you have to be enormously careful of. Take a look at politicians, for example. Okay? Politicians pretend to be experts on legal issues, on government policy, on this, on that, on social things, on education. They pretend to be experts in everything. And people readily give them their authority, right? They give them all this power over their own lives. They give government power over their own lives. But how many times have you seen politicians being pulled up for their ignorance? In the UK recently we had this thing with Diane Abbott, who was a member of the Labour Party. She was pulled up on her ignorance many, many times. She couldn't even do basic math. Okay? In the US it's happened many a time as well. Right? Your politicians know nothing, but they pretend to know everything. They're the pretenders, they masquerade. Well, it's the same thing with certain members in the police force. Or certain people in the military. They masquerade as experts. There are certain types of generals, for example, who are armchair generals, who are paper tigers, okay? And this is what people call the deep state again, right? They don't fully understand that that term is just meant to obfuscate the real thing that's going on here, which is that these types of generals graduate from West Point, and so everyone assumes that they know what they're talking about. But unless you've been in a war zone, unless you have started a war and then ended a war, and in between had a decent exit strategy, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. Do you see what I'm saying? There are many people out there who are in positions of power that are masquerading as authorities, and that's what causes the problem, because everyone defers to their judgment. They assume they must be right. What makes you think that they're right? What makes you think that they know what they're talking about? Have you grilled them yourself? Right? That's my point. That's what's actually happening to a great extent. That people don't know that you're not just born with rights, you're born with responsibilities to your fellow human beings. And the moment you start usurping the power of nature, this is something I'll go into in another video. But the moment you start believing yourself to be a god fundamentally, that you feel that you have god-like power to decide who lives and who dies, not only have you become a despot, but you've become evil. You've assumed none of the responsibility that goes along with the rights of being a sentient being, a sapient being. Sorry for going off on a rant like that, guys, right? But I think these are also important things that people need to understand. But those are my basic recommendations for books, by the way, and I'll detail these in the description as well, and I'll maybe put a post up as well with all these books and the names of these books and the authors, so that you can go and read them, and that you can hopefully gain something from their work, as I certainly have. But I want to thank you all very, very much for proposing that as a suggestion as well, because it is useful to other viewers out there also, I think. So thank you very much. Take good care of yourselves, and God bless you all.